very warm welcome indeed to the first masterclass of the year by Einar Partners. Quite exciting. This is a topic which we've seen been growing more and more as of lately, and something that we have been very busy with. So for the upcoming 1 hour here, we will speak about what it really means to scale CMDB governance and how that ties into the culture of a CMDB. So it's quite a deep dive masterclass. And as I said before, we have quite a lot of material to go through. But for those of you who don't really know who I am and who we're speaking right now, my name is Alexander. I am the managing director at Einar Partners. And as I explained, this is a topic which is very, very close to my heart because I've been working with CMDBs for over 12 years now. And for me, fundamentally, the CMDB is more than anything about the human aspects. And that's why I'm so excited to speak about this topic and to share some of the insights that I have seen in my career so far. However, I'm not just alone today. I have another co-host with me. So Joshua, who are you?
So I'm Joshua. So hi, everyone. I'm actually a recent import to Europe. So I am originally from New Zealand, spent about 5.5 years there, digging into ServiceNow as a consultant. And then, yeah, I thought what Einar Partners are doing are really cool. So about 6 months ago, I basically traveled halfway across the world and have arrived here and been working with Einar Partners since. So yeah, my main areas of interest are more along the ITOM side, of course, being with Einar Partners. And so I've also worked a lot with the CMDB in the past as well.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. Such a journey all the way from New Zealand to get all the way to Luxembourg, the small country of Luxembourg. Super cool. All right, man. So we have a lot to go through today indeed. And this, just to set the stage a little bit for those of you who are dropping in and joining right now, what you can expect today and what you will learn from this masterclass is, first of all, how do we define CMDB governance? It sounds pretty basic maybe, but trust me, there is a lot of different interpretations of what is CMDB governance. Another thing that we will be speaking very heavily about is how do you really create that CMDB dream team? And I believe you, Joshua, have quite some insights to share there as well. And fundamentally as well, what we often see is that one thing which is very important for CMDBs is to create that so-called organic buy-in. So the CMDB really becomes a phenomena with people who want to use the CMDB. So how do we create that buy-in is something that we will touch upon briefly. And last but not least, we will try here during the session as well to speak a little bit about common pitfalls and failures, so to speak, that we have seen when it comes to the area of CMDB governance. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we jump into it. So there is a Q&A chat box, which you should be able to use, which means that you can ask questions to us directly. We either will answer it on the spot or we will answer it at the end of the masterclass. Or if it's a too complex question or we don't have the time, we'll get back to you personally afterwards. Also, this session is being recorded, so you will be able to find it on YouTube and we will send you all the recording afterwards. And third but not least, if you're wondering, well, who are Einar Partners and why do we speak about CMDB governance? We are a specialized firm when it comes to CMDB and IT operations. And I would say that we've, the past 2 years, been exposed to and worked on almost 50 CMDBs. So it's definitely something which is very close to our heart. With that being said, then just to set some expectations, because of course, some of you who are sitting here today, you might already have been working with CMDBs for a long time. Maybe you're a configuration manager, etc. But just a few bullet points here. So first of all, what we're speaking about is platform independent. It means that hopefully, regardless of whatever platform you are using when it comes to a CMDB, you can translate this knowledge. Secondly, we're mainly focusing on the infrastructure side of things when we speak about governance. We don't explicitly focus so much on the service layers, so like business services, IT services, etc. Reason for that is it would probably require a separate masterclass in of itself. And then last but not least, this webinar targets organizations and individuals really all the way from if you've never really worked or if your organization don't have a CMDB, all the way to if you already have quite a mature CMDB. Regardless of where in that spectrum you find yourself, we hope that you can take some key lessons out of this. There is one caveat. We do assume that the audience knows at least the very basics of configuration management, things like what is a configuration item, what is a CI class, for example, or a CI type. So I hope that sounds fair and square. And with that being said, let's get into it a little bit. Now, I always like to do a bit of storytelling. So first of all, let's start with some of the common challenges we see and what is the basis of us creating this masterclass, setting the stage a little bit. Unfortunately, CMDBs tend to have a poor reputation. You got to keep in mind that we encounter a lot of different organizations with a lot of different maturities. And what we often hear is that, oh, come on, Alex, haven't we been speaking about configuration management for 20 years already? There are so many examples of failed CMDBs, and this is basically what we live to change a little bit. So it's quite common with the mindset to have things like hearing the CMDB feels quite stiff and it just focuses on traditional infrastructure. There's too much data and there's no point of keeping track of it all. Does it really provide any value? Or things like, well, isn't CMDB really an old ITIL concept? Does it really belong in the modern world of IT? Fundamentally, I think the CMDB deserves to be looked at a little bit differently, the year 2023. Because a modern CMDB, it should be able to support cloud, on-prem, microservices, and business layers. So it's not that old concept anymore. Regards of the data, and this is what we'll be speaking a lot today about, the CMDB can either be very minimalistic or it can be super granular down to the bits and bytes level. So it's not black or white. And last but not least, then the CMDB is, yes, an old concept which was created 20 years ago, but a modern CMDB, we have seen plenty examples of how that can integrate with CI/CD, pipelines, Azure DevOps, infrastructure as code, all of these things. So I just wanted to call out the elephant in the room a little bit, that the CMDB tends to have a little poor reputation sometimes, and this is something that we often encounter. I don't know, Joshua, would you say that you agree upon these things? Is this something that you've heard yourself in your career so far?
I would agree, yeah. But for the most part, I would say a lot of customers also do really understand the need for a CMDB because, you know, they've been in a situation where they perhaps don't have a CMDB and they see the real, drawbacks of that consequence. So yeah, this definitely still is in the mind of some out there, but also a lot do really appreciate the need for a CMDB as well.
Right. So why don't you take us through some of the common challenges that we've been observing so far, both at Einar Partners, but also previously in your career?
Yeah. So that's a bit of a funny observance that I made because I thought, moving to Europe, I might see, pretty different behaviors in organizations, but actually, we're all human and, everything kind of affects us the same. So, what I've noticed with configuration management, both here and back home, is that all of these three common challenges apply. So the first I want to talk about is we tend to underestimate the effort it takes to maintain a CMDB. So often, most businesses, they might undergo a project to implement a CMDB, for example, because, a lot of them might organically grow and they might realize that our CMDB is not up to scratch. So we need to, get that up to speed. So they'll do that. They'll implement some nice new CMDB, new processes, etc. but then they might underestimate the effort it takes to maintain that state of their CMDB. So one thing I often see is, customers and organizations, they might have dedicated roles for the CMDB, but eventually over time, they'll think, oh, the CMDB is going fine as it is. Let's just have this one role take on a little bit of responsibility over here. So then they've got less time to spend on the CMDB. And of course, the CMDB, the nature of it is that it's not going to fall apart as soon as you stop paying attention to it, right? So it is very easy for us to, simply ignore it for a little bit of time as it slowly degrades. And we can't really appreciate how that affects the rest of the business. So that's one common challenge that we see, because eventually, it'll get so bad that the rest of the business loses confidence in it. And yeah, that's just not a situation you want to be in. So that's probably the core challenge that I often see. The next one is that the CMDB is built but not used. So, we'll make a new shiny CMDB, but we won't, maybe organizations don't fully appreciate how it would actually be used by the business, or they don't often get feedback from the rest of the business in terms of how can they easily use CMDB, and how can it serve them? And lastly, too much data but little value. So this really depends on your organization, because, as you said before, some, CMDB can be very granular, or it can be very less granular, let's say. So depending on the needs of the organization, some might need a specific amount of data, some might not need that much. And it can be easy to get a bit carried away, especially when we're implementing discovery tools, that we just want everything, right? But we might not think about how do we maintain all of that everything that we take in, and are we kind of drowning out with noise the actual valuable data that we want? So those are,
I think it's excellent points, and this is obviously something that I've been observing myself before, especially around this last point of so many times there hasn't always been like clear use cases defined. It's just been like, oh, this is cool, we can integrate lots of data, etc. But that's obviously what we're going to speak about a little bit today. Not so much the use cases, but more like the governance around all of this. So thanks a lot for that, Joshua. Now let's get into a little bit of the actual governance part of a CMDB. So what do we really mean when we say CMDB governance? I'd like to, first of all, demystify this concept a little bit. So what most people are used to, like regardless of which platform you're working with, what most people are used to when it comes to the CMDB, it's things like a process diagram. What you see in front of you here, I'm not going to go through it, but basically what you're seeing is the CMDB in the middle, and then you have all sorts of interactions with other processes. How do we load the data? So this you can find plenty of. You can find it in ITIL, you can find it at different vendors like BMC, ServiceNow, you name it. Tons and tons of process diagrams. But that's not really what we're speaking about today. So I'd like to show here our interpretation of CMDB governance in its most basic form. So when it comes to CMDB governance, then we have some core elements of CMDB governance. And it doesn't really matter how big your organization is. In our experience, then whatever it comes to when it is in governance, most of those things can be tied to these three main elements. So it's either about the roles, so who are involved in the CMDB, who are the consumers of the CMDB, who is allowed to design the CMDB, for example. Then it is the responsibilities and tasks. So essentially there, what is expected from me when I'm working with the CMDB. I'm getting a lot of sun in my face here. It's a very sunny day. And then last but not least, maintaining the data in various ways. So these tends to be the core elements of CMDB governance. Now, if we do this well, then we also make sure that the CMDB generates value. And let me explain what I mean with this. So let's say if you're a configuration manager, then probably you are focusing on that the CMDB should deliver value to the business, for example. Just as an example, meanwhile, if you're working in the network infrastructure team, probably you are maintaining data and you have tasks and responsibilities to make sure that the data in the CMDB generates value for the network team and people who are dependent on that data. So I guess what I'm saying is that these three things combined, that is good governance. And if we do these things well, we also make sure that CMDB really generate that value and that it's tangible values that people really feel and can understand. And as a result of that, if we have values which are being proven of the CMDB, it also starts creating a culture. So it's a little bit different than a process diagram. It's a little bit more abstract, but I just wanted to throw out this definition here. What do we mean when we speak about CMDB governance? It's more on the people side of things, how we generate value, how we create that culture around the CMDB, rather than the process of configuration management.
Yeah, and I see some of our some of the questions and answers just really talking about, you know, when you talk about creating culture that really drives us forward. I would also say that the opposite is true, right? If you don't make sure that we're maintaining and have those responsibilities and tasks in place, you can create a culture that doesn't value the CMDB and doesn't want, you know, to deal with it. So that's also something we need to be careful about. And I see, yeah, some questions, answers coming through about that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Very interesting. Very interesting. So we've been able to observe some of the characteristics of, let's say, good CMDB governance. And again, you can probably find more points here. This is just some of the main highlights that we have been able to find. But if we speak about good CMDB governance, again, it's about values that can be demonstrated. I'm not speaking about values written down here in a paper somewhere or in some obscure wiki page in the internal intranet. No, I'm speaking about real values where one team is doing their job better than another team. Why? Because they are using the CMDB and they are maintaining the CMDB and they're really taking it seriously. Another problem is often the why. So why should I work with all of this data? Why should I maintain all of this data? Good CMDB governance, it answers the fundamental concepts of what's in it for me and what's in it for others if I do all of this. Why should I invest the time, basically? But fundamentally, good CMDB governance is also repeatable and scalable. What I mean with that is a good CMDB governance, it's a framework. So you can easily add more people to it. You can increase the size. You can increase the team that maintains the CMDB. You can increase the size of the CMDB, the data we should include, etc., etc. So good CMDB governance shouldn't have to be redesigned over and over again, but it should be fairly repeatable and scalable. So basically, CMDB governance is not just a document, but really, this is the cultural foundation that makes or breaks a CMDB. Now, with that being said, let's get into creating the CMDB dream team a little bit. So Joshua, why don't you take over from here? And if you share your screen, give us some highlights on this topic. I see you're still on mute, by the way. Classic.
Thank you. Sorry, that would have caught me off guard. Thank you for that. So yes, chapter 3, let's get into it, shall we? So let's first talk about the sizing and involved roles of the CMDB Dream Team. So when we look at this, we often think about, well, different organizations, of course, they'll have different sizes of their CMDB. Different sizes of the CMDB require different expertise, different teams, essentially. So most organizations we interact with will be small and medium, where the small teams will only consist of the configuration manager and CI class owners. And we'll talk about what exactly these roles are a bit later. With medium-sized organizations, you'll also additionally have a CMDB process owner. Now, this is not to say that, for a small team, you don't have a process owner, but typically that is encapsulated by the configuration manager. So with a medium size, we typically see that we separate out those roles and make sure they have a dedicated resource for each of those. And finally, for large organizations, and this is quite large, we even see the addition of a CMDB board, which is, I would say, pretty similar to the likes of a change board, if you're used to that concept, where they're really responsible for making sure that the CMDB is really aligned to the business values, and any changes that may be made to the overall process or the CMDB kind of goes through that board and make sure that it's all aligned to the business's goals.
Yeah, I would just like to add there, most times I've seen that has been an absolutely enormous organizations like big banks and that sort of thing. Like the CMDB board is, it belongs to the far and few in between, let's say, that we are working with at least.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So because of that, because the vast majority of people are likely only with the small and medium, that is what we're going to focus on today. So we won't really talk about that CMDB board more in depth.
Right.
So let's talk about what each role does. So again, we've got the CMDB process owner, config manager, and CI class owners. So I'll just briefly talk about the primary goal of each role. So the CMDB process owner, they're the one who owns the process. So their main concern is ensuring that the process in place is appropriate for the organization and make sure that it meets the business goals of the organization. Next, we've got the configuration manager, who are mainly concerned with ensuring that the CMDB itself has quality data and that it is able to deliver what the organization needs in terms of, are we serving our users when they use the CMDB? Can they effectively use it? Or are we able to produce the reports that we expect? And lastly, we have the CI class owners. So these are the people who are responsible for the CIs. So things like devices, you can think of a server. They're responsible for owning that and making sure that it is all up to date. And they can often work with the configuration manager to make sure that that is accurately represented in the CMDB. And as I mentioned before, with small organizations, often the CMDB process owner and the configuration manager, that role is typically done by just a single resource.
Yeah.
Again, simply because it's so easy.
Yeah. And maybe to add to this here, Joshua, is of course, if you go out there and you find like descriptions, role descriptions, etc., for like config managers, there will be a way longer list of different tasks and responsibilities, etc. But this is like, we've obviously boiled it down here to the main points. So like, hence the simplified version of each role here. But yeah, I agree. Like these are the most common that we see. And like you said, like the CMDB process owner and config manager, especially in the beginning phases of a CMDB, tends to sometimes be the same person basically wearing two hats. It's not unusual, at least. Right.
Yeah, that's my expectation.
All right.
So let's talk a bit more about how do the roles interact. I touched upon this a little bit, but here we've got a nice graphical representation of this. So typically the CMDB process owner and the configuration manager will often work closely because of course the configuration manager is using the CMDB process. So they might communicate about, how can we ensure that the process is more optimized? What makes it easier? How can I better deliver value? Things like that. And the configuration manager will also interact with not only the CI owners, but also other consumers of the CMDB. So again, they'll get feedback. They'll often work with the CI owners to make sure that their CIs are accurately reflected in the CMDB, as well as ensuring that the likes of the service desk can effectively use the CMDB to perform their tasks. So for example, you can think of when we deal with incidents or change requests, how easy is it for me to find the CIs that I need to, for example? And often that can involve other roles, but the configuration manager plays a role there as well.
Yeah, yeah. I see we also received a comment here from someone of the participants that they are indeed both a configuration manager and a CMDB process owner at the same time. So indeed quite common. Yeah.
Yeah. Next, I want to talk about a concept of centralized versus decentralized teams when it comes to the CMDB Dream Team, and also their other interacting roles. So first, there is a concept of a centralized team where the CMDB team itself, they will take sole responsibility of ensuring that, how would you say, like the things like mandatory fields, how the CMDB is built, what auditing compliances there are. That is what the CMDB team, in a centralized manner, how they will administer their CMDB. So we see this most commonly in highly regulated industries where, the likes of, storage teams, network teams, people who contribute and consume the CMDB, they need to adhere to certain, audit regulations, things like that. So they must obey kind of the rules set out by the central CMDB team.
Yeah. Yeah.
The next is a decentralized concept. So this is actually where those consumers and contributors to the CMDB actually have a bit more control about what they can do. So this is where they can set their own rules, kind of think about, okay, well, actually, I want this data source to populate for my CIs, so they can take on that responsibility and that role a bit, and they can help drive the business to move in a way that supports what they want to see in their CMDB. So they have a little bit more autonomy versus the centralized concept as well. And what I would say is that this does require, as we note down the bottom, this does require more active education, because you need to consider that, how well do these teams know their CMDB? Are their proposals, do they make sense in the wider picture? Things like that.
Yeah, and I think this is so instrumental to the topic of governance, because imagine you're an organization which embarks on a journey of creating a CMDB. It can be a global org or a smaller organization, doesn't really matter. But fundamentally, you always have these different teams within the IT department, cloud team, storage team, network team, Windows server team, whatever it might be. So the question is, should these teams be allowed the autonomy to take decisions and design their own part of the CMDB, to update things there, to have a saying when it comes, again, to the design of things? How should we load the data? What is important for us? Should we grant them that autonomy? Of course, still following best practices, still having, following all the rules, or should it be a central team where all of those decisions are made for them? So this is something which tends to be underestimated, I would say, when it comes to the topic of governance. How much autonomy do we allow these different teams to have of their part of the CMDB? And there's nothing really right or wrong here, but at least based on my experience, what I have seen most commonly is like a hybrid model where there tends to be some sort of central governance, but then you still have that autonomy for the individual teams, that they have a saying at least on, this is how we want to design this part of the CMDB. Yeah, really interesting, really interesting. So we have spoken quite a lot about the configuration manager, CI class owners, etc. And I'd like to share the screen here now, hijack the screen share a little bit, and
take it away.
Let's speak about the config manager, because the config manager is perhaps the most misunderstood yet most important role, I would say, within a successful CMDB governance model. So in my experience, then the optimal config manager, that is essentially a person who will ensure that the CMDB really gets used. Keep in mind, it's often a large investment. We don't build a CMDB, in a day or two, but it's a huge, often organizational undertaking. So to really make sure that the CMDB gets used, given that large investment, super critical. The config manager ideally should also drive the development forward. So it's not just a person who is having a list of tasks and this is what I should do every day, but ideally this is also a person who thinks ahead a little bit and like, okay, how can we use this CMDB to continue to drive development, to improve things, to help other processes, etc., etc. So essentially what we're saying is ideally the config manager should be a little bit of a diplomat who can also generate that internal buy-in and excitement for the topic of CMDB. What we often see is, and not often, but sometimes what we see is that there tends to be a poor assignment of a config manager. So for example, it's just a hat without a meaning. This person X is now a config manager, good luck. Or that it tends to sometimes be treated as very mechanical work where there's very little autonomy, and that here is again list of tasks, do these things, make sure that these reports are working, have fun. And also the third point is something also very common is that the config manager don't receive that formal commitment from the organization to really work with configuration management and governance. So if you don't have that formal commitment, very difficult to drive innovation then. So ideally, how we see it is that the config manager should really be that go-to person for multiple teams that people keep on referring to, and this person makes sure that the config management as well as the governance of it really becomes the beating heart of the IT organization, and sometimes even beyond the IT organization. So don't underestimate the importance of a good config manager. Now, I probably understand what you're thinking now. Hey, Alex, how can we find a person like this? The market is already tough as it is, you know. So what do we do if we don't have this strong diplomat profile, this business savvy person who can forecast things and, you know, drive this development? Well, don't worry about it. You can still have good CMDB governance. It just means that you probably need to enforce things by policy a bit more. And what I mean with that is, if you don't have an ambassador and diplomat, well, then people probably are not going to be very willing and understand why they should be working with the CMDB. So in that case, you probably need to have stronger policy dictated that you have to work with these things. And on that topic, if you don't have that sort of ambassador, then management buy-in or having that sort of executive sponsorship, it becomes even more critical then. Because yeah, otherwise, if you have a really good config manager who are that diplomat, you can actually have, you know, fairly lukewarm executive sponsorship, but that person is still someone who excites other teams and makes sure that the CMDB is requested. Now, about this sort of team setup, I'm not going to go through the following slide in depth detail. For those of you who are interested, we can send out this one later, but we've created a little bit of a resource matrix for how you can plan the CMDB dream team. And we have based this actually on 22 organizations that we have worked with, and we have looked at how they have set up their CMDB. And you know, we have obviously helped them with coaching when it comes to the CMDB. So the first thing is the CMDB complexity. What we're looking at when we say complexity are things like, how big is the CMDB? What is the size of the CMDB? How many processes is the CMDB integrated with? Are we using only infrastructure layers or also service layers? What are the compliance requirements that, for example, Joshua were referring to before? So those things together, they constitute the complexity of the CMDB. And here you see examples of low, medium to high. And we can actually see here, I'm not going to go through everything, but the most common team setup, if you have a fairly low complexity of the CMDB, so maybe just basic infrastructure, maybe some integration to ITSM, maybe some reporting, and that's it. Is typically the config manager is around 0.4 to 0.7 FTE. So also we here have a CI class owners, which are various teams, and those teams tends to spend around 8 to 16 hours per month per infrastructure team. So what is interesting here is that we see that there is the roles of process owner and configuration manager, like we discussed, but in a CMDB of a bit lower complexity, they tend to be combined into one role, basically. Now, for medium complexity, there we start seeing that all of a sudden, there is actually a dedicated CMDB process owner. And what we have seen is very common is that often when a CMDB grows to higher complexity, then the previous configuration manager basically takes ownership of the process, and then a dedicated new hire is done to hire a dedicated config manager, basically. Then after that, on very highly complex CMDBs, again, speaking global organizations, banks, etc., then we tend to see a more complex setup with, for example, one full-time configuration manager, and then what we call a configuration analyst, which we haven't really discussed today, but basically the right hand of the config manager a little bit, and then a CMDB process owner who is working, half time only to improve the process, and then quite a lot of commitment from CI class owners. Of course, this resource matrix is not perfect. It doesn't include things like service owners, application owners, etc. But it's just to give an indicative idea. And at least based on our experience, I would say that 80% of organizations, they will be able to survive very, very long on one FTE as a config manager, and maybe also the CMDB process owner. It's quite rare, or it requires quite large CMDBs and organizations to go above one dedicated FTE for a config manager, basically. Again, just to give some inspiration there. So some final advice here when it comes to this team setup. One, start small and expand the team gradually. And what I think is really important here is to have the use cases dictating the team setup. And let me explain what I mean with that. So it's very easy to look at the CMDB and look at all the data and think, whoa, there's so much data. So based on the amount of data, it should dictate how big and complex the team should be. But that's not really true, because you can have a lot of data, but if you have no use cases and the data is not used, well, then it doesn't really matter. You don't need to maintain it because you don't use the data. So if you have a lot of use cases, then probably you want to have a little bit bigger team, a little bit more active team. But if you only have a few use cases like change management, incident management, some basic reporting maybe, then you can start really, really small. Again, think about that centralized versus decentralized concept when it comes to the CMDB governance. Are we going to allow autonomy to various teams? Is it going to be a hybrid model? Or are we going to strictly enforce the design and the policies of the CMDB that all the different teams simply have to adhere to? Be intentional about that config manager, like I explained before. Super important. Often it tends to be more successful to have more of a people person than a highly technical person when it comes to config management, because ultimately a good config manager should ideally work on creating relationships and being an ambassador a little bit. Also very common is to underestimate the formal commitment. So make sure you don't do that. When it comes to config managers, CI class owners, there's always people who need to provide input. Then, yeah, it's very difficult to add any sort of value if you don't really have time freed up to create good designs and to really think about the team and how it should design the CMDB. So again, these are some general advice that we have seen when it comes to creating this successful CMDB team. But yeah, I hope that it's useful. Okay, let's speak then a little bit more about the governance models and buy-in. So, so far we've spoken about the team setup. We've spoken about, how many FTEs or full-time employees should we have? Is it the config manager and process owner the same person? What is CMDB governance? But let's speak then a little bit about how do we really generate that buy-in? Okay, so the CMDB is one thing from a technical perspective, but how do we spread it culturally? And how do we design good governance? So let's start with mapping the as-is situation. So for those of you on the call who maybe are about in an organization to build the first CMDB ever, or if you already have a CMDB organization, but you're suffering from low buy-in, so people don't use it, people don't take it seriously, etc., then I think this is going to be applicable for both of you. Doesn't really matter where you are here. I hope you can take some key lessons out of it. But there are a few key pillars that at least I've been able to observe in my career when it comes to organic buy-in. So the key here is we want people to look at the CMDB and think, oh snap, I also want this. Like, it's not just about enforcing that you have to do these things, but we actively want people to request the CMDB and like, okay, this really would be helpful. Now, how do we get there? First of all, define tangible values and use cases. Sounds really, really basic, but this is often missed. And of course, that's, quite an internal job. You can use consultants, etc., to find these use cases, but otherwise, don't do that mistake of building an entire CMDB and then ask yourself, like, how are we going to use this? Because there is always use cases out there. There is always values out there of the CMDB. But then it becomes so important to really write that down and have it formalized, because then you really have something you can measure towards. You have things that you can speak about towards other teams when you're going to generate this buy-in. Another quite common thing is one mistake is not including teams early enough in the CMDB build process. And it doesn't matter if you build a CMDB from scratch or if you're going to expand your existing CMDB. The mistake of not including teams is what we see being repeated over and over again. Because think about it. If you are not included early enough in the process, you are way, way less likely to actually use the things. But if you are part of building, good governance, you are part of building the future, then you are way, way more inclined to actually use that as well and speak good about it in the organization and towards other teams. Also, when you speak to different teams, let's say you're a config manager or someone else who wants to spread the gossip of the CMDB, then make sure to find champions. And what I mean with that is, in the network team, in the storage team, in the cloud team, there will always be at least one person who is like, oh yeah, Alex, this is exactly what we needed. That person who gets it. So finding and identifying those champions and keeping them close to you, super important, because again, they will be your ambassadors a little bit. So these are the three, let's say, key pillars that we have been able to identify when it comes to organic buy-in. Now, how do we do this then? How do we create that buy-in? I mean, the pillars are one thing, but how do we actually achieve that organic buy-in? Well, first of all, have a stepped approach. And a common fallacy that at least I've been exposed to a lot, and I'm not sure about you, Joshua, but I could imagine the same, is that something that I often hear is, well, the CMDB is useless if we don't have everything in it. So if we don't have all the relationship, all the data, and all the context, then it doesn't mean anything for us. But
yeah,
that's not true. I think
yeah,
that's
that,
absolutely not true.
yeah, and I mean that really ties into one of the common challenges that we raised before in terms of some organizations, they can't really recognize what data they need and what they don't. But yeah, I do certainly see this a lot where, yeah, they just want to consume everything without really taking a step back and thinking, well, hang on, do we really need this?
Exactly. And also that sort of mindset of it's everything or nothing. Either we have the perfect CMDB or it's worthless and we shouldn't have a CMDB at all. So that's a very common fallacy. And there is always value, even in the most minimalistic version of a CMDB, if you compare to nothing. But the reason for this stepped approach is that all of these different teams, they already have their own tools. So they are using SCCM or they're using Cisco ACI or whatever it might be. And the idea is not that we're going to compete with them and sort of phase them out. But this is about creating friendships. This is about really working smart politically. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, there is some internal work that you likely want to do first before you even start speaking to consultants or anything like that. And namely, one, include these key team members early to provide input on the CMDB, the creation of it, or if you're going to expand it. Discover those real use cases as early as possible. So what can be achieved with a minimum amount of data? There's always stuff that can be done better, and you don't need that perfect world that I explained before. Also super important, having that sort of long-term vision and being able to explain that, super important, and being able to create that long-term vision together with these initial champions that you have been able to find of like, okay, well, the first step of CMDB, the first step of CMDB governance, the people involved, the way we're going to work with it, it's going to look this way. But 1 year later, it might look differently because we're going to expand it in the following ways, and that's going to put the following requirements on the organization. And also their executive buy-in. It's not, I would say, a lot of people would say that this is critical. I have seen organizations where you don't have the executive buy-in, but you can still create like a good CMDB simply because the people on the floor needs it and they understand it. But it sure makes things easier if you do. Okay, now after this, how do we go on about promoting the CMDB governance then? Well, 3 main points that we have been seeing here. First of all, make it super accessible and simple. And I'm going to get back to this in a bit, but don't overcomplicate things with governance. It shouldn't have to take like 5 pages of a Confluence site somewhere to understand just the basics of how I maintain data, etc. But make it simple. Have nice dashboards, have nice tools, make it very accessible for people to work with their data, to certify their data, whatever it is. User friendliness is key, because if you're going to promote CMDB governance, then yeah, it needs to look a bit sexy. It needs to look a bit easy, basically. Also, show that you can integrate the CMDB in other processes as soon as possible. So nobody wants to build a CMDB and work on governance if it takes 1 or 2 years before they see any value. So really try and identify how we can integrate this into the different teams almost from day one. Another aspect, work on the internal communications as well as soon as possible. Make some promotions about the CMDB, about the governance, why it is important. And really have the organization participate in this, because otherwise you're a one-man army and it's difficult to promote governance if you're by yourself, basically. And last but not least, again, these are the basic things. So when it comes to governing the CMDB, assign ownerships early. So just having that sense of ownership of the CMDB, the earlier you can establish that in different teams, the earlier you can establish those ownerships. And it doesn't really matter what it is, if it is infrastructure owners, if it is application owners, but ownership's super, super important. And a lot of organizations struggle there. Also, listen to feedback from the teams, make improvements, make it a priority, make sure that you really hear them and that you're addressing the concerns or the optimizations or whatever it might be. And also the governance models that you're building, and I'm going to speak about that just in a second here, do it with teams, not just for teams. So really make it a co-creation effort to like, okay, well, how do we want to maintain this? How should we maintain it? Why should we maintain it? What values does it give? But do that together with the teams. Don't just come up with them with a big list of things and say, this is now what you have to do, basically. So some advice here on governance models, especially, because again, it ties into this thing that everybody wants everything from day one. Number one, when it comes to format and shape of a governance model, don't over-engineer governance, especially not in the beginning. I've seen so many times governance, documents being like 200 pages long, and it's the most dry and boring thing ever. Don't over-engineer governance. There is beauty in simplicity. And also, don't confuse the CMDB design with governance. And what I mean with that is, we have often seen in governance models that it mentions these are the CI classes we're having, this is how the CMDB is structured, etc. That really has no place in governance. Governance should rather answer, how do we add new CI classes to the CMDB? How do we expand the CMDB? What are the policies for it, etc., etc. And also be a bit creative with the formats of governance. It doesn't just have to be one document, as I said. Something very successful that we have seen is create instructional videos, create small video snippets for how people create reports, how do they find the data, how do they maintain the data. The more creative you can be with formats, the easier it is to consume the governance, basically. Now, last but not least, when you develop a governance model, what we have seen rather successful is do it in MVP versions. What I mean with that is, don't try to have everything in the governance model from day one, but split it up. Maybe the first governance model is something simple as, well, this is the security requirements we have, these are the basic ownerships, and these are the processes it integrates with. Maybe the second version is, this is how vendors are integrating with the CMDB, etc., etc. So chop up the elephant, basically. Now, a lot of talking there, and we're reaching almost the end, and I see there's been quite a lot of questions coming in. I haven't really been reading them. Have you been looking into them, Joshua?
Yeah, just a little bit. I think some of them we want to actually answer, talking. So yeah, yeah. And I would like to get some of your input as well on some of these questions. So
sure. So let's then end off with just these 3 common pitfalls we've observed. And I think we spoke yesterday, Joshua, about the first point, and you had some inputs there about this quality that degrades over time. Could you care to explain a bit more?
Yeah, it's kind of like the, I'm not sure if people are really familiar with this analogy of the frog in boiling water.
Right.
It's kind of the CMDB, as I mentioned before, as it degrades, it's really slow. So it can be very difficult to really appreciate just how much effort it takes to maintain. And so if you don't put that maintenance in place, slowly over time, it degrades. I've seen organizations that, they allow that to happen, and then suddenly they're having to invest in another new project where they have to re-implement their discovery tools, etc., because they just let things go kind of that far along, and they didn't have, those champions to really drive that. So yeah, that's something that I see quite a lot of, that I'm quite passionate about. That's what I see as like one of the main pitfalls,
right,
which I tend to say.
Yeah, well, another thing that I've been seeing is, minimalism in the CMDB governance. It's often neglected. So what I mean with that is, again, it ties into what I said before, but there is beauty in minimalism when it comes to CMDB governance. And this tends to sometimes be neglected in favor of over-engineering governance models, people for some reason admires complexity, but really the key often when it comes to governance is simplicity. Simplicity, at least in the beginning. Then you can gradually expand on it. And third, but not least, another common pitfall that I've been able to observe is, again, not making the governance user-friendly enough. So if it's super difficult to understand it, if it takes a lot of clicking around on some intranet page, etc., then yeah, it shouldn't take 2 months to onboard someone to work with the CMDB. Again, make it user-friendly, whatever it comes to. If it's videos that explaining things, if it's nice dashboards, but put the key focus on the user friendliness, and yeah, you will create a lot of friends. Now, we're coming here now to the end of the masterclass. I'm just gonna scroll through some of the questions here. There are some questions here. Will we get a recording for the session? Absolutely. Did we consider multi-source system to feed on CMDB for our resource planning matrix? And can you please share the slide to the audience for the meeting? So yes, multi-source systems has been considered. The only thing which it does not address is obviously if you do things manually updated, then yeah, that resource planning matrix can pretty much be thrown out the window. You have to add a few FTEs to it. But otherwise, yes, multi-source in the sense of, not only using discovery, but integrations. But there is one caveat to this resource planning matrix, which is it only speaks about the configuration management. It only speaks about the CI class owners. It does not look at owners for integrations or the discovery administrator, for example. That's a separate topic. This just looks at the config management governance in of itself. Now, do we have some more here? We get a question from Ingemar, who's writing, I'm wondering about required and recommended training for CMDB managers, CI owners, config managers, etc. Do you have any recommendations for trainings? It's a very interesting topic. We at Einar Partners have actually created, this is closed training material for some of our clients. I will get back to you on that personally, because maybe the rest of the audience could also find it useful. I don't know, Joshua, do you, when it comes to training, the tasks in the CMDB, etc., is that something you've been exposed to? I haven't found any courses myself that I can, recommend on the top of my head, unfortunately.
No, typically in the past, when I've done training, it's always kind of tailored to the organization and their CMDB in place. Right. That's typically how I've done it. Yeah.
Okay, there are a few more questions, but I want to be mindful and respectful of people's time, and given the fact that we only have 1 minute left. So thanks so much for participating. It was great to see so many people having joined. If you're interested more in the topic of CMDB governance, as mentioned, you can always go back to this video recording later. But if you want, no strings attached, you can also use this QR code or this URL here, einar.partners/book, and you can then get a completely for free IT operations strategy session with me and with Joshua, and we can pick this apart. And also, don't forget to follow Einar Partners on LinkedIn. We have much more masterclasses coming up. Make sure to follow our YouTube channel. And as always, if you have more questions, then you're always welcome to reach out to us.